Last time I spoke with Gabe Brown and Alan Williams, we talked about fixing America's broken water cycle. Well, once we have that online, we can also fix America's broken rural economies.
Our son, who is 37 now, had a graduating class of nearly 400, of which about 50 were sons and daughters of farmers and ranchers. Today, to my knowledge, he is the only one of those 50 who are actively involved in production agriculture.
So we fast forward to today in an Oktibbeha County, Mississippi, where just 50 years ago, there were 800 plus dairy farms that were making money. Today, there are 0 private dairies in the county, not a one.
We can see the difference that this makes.
This says it all. He said, Gabe, the thing my wife and I are most happy about, our 2 children now want to consider farming.
That regenerative stuff is nice, but we can't feed the world that way. And my contention is, no, you're wrong. We can't feed the world conventionally. If we keep going the way we're going there, we are going to face famine. We are going to face issues. But we can more than feed the world by farming regeneratively, because every acre is producing a lot more food, and not just food, but much more phytonutrient-rich food.
All that and more on this episode 404 of the Working Cows podcast, brought to you by Understanding Ag.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows podcast, recorded exclusively in the Understanding Ag studios. And I'm always delighted to be joined again by Gabe Brown and Dr. Alan Williams. And we're going to talk to them today about how do we fix America's broken rural economies. This is part 2 of a discussion we had about fixing America's broken agricultural system, really, but it starts with the water cycle, right? And so that was part 1. You can listen to this and still understand it all, still track with us, but you can also go back and listen to part 1 if you want to, before you come back here and listen to part 2. So very excited for this conversation. We talk a lot about a lot of different pieces of this puzzle, from phytonutrient-rich food to the health crisis in America, to the rural economies and what they're facing, and even national security. So very excited for this conversation. And here it is. Here's my conversation with Gabe Brown and Dr. Alan Williams. Gabe, Alan, thanks for joining me again on the Working Cows podcast. Welcome back.
Thank you, Clay.
Thanks, Clay. Great to be here.
So we talked in kind of part 1 of this discussion about the state of agriculture and regenerative agriculture. And now I'd kind of like to talk about how this kind of impacts the world that we live in, our own rural communities, national security. Start off with some of those things. So how do this lack of profitability in agriculture affect rural communities? Just drive down Main Street, right?
Yep. Yeah. Well, obviously, Clay, with the current production model, the vast amount of wealth is being exported from our rural communities. Many farms, ranches today are becoming, the old mantra is you got to get bigger, get bigger, get bigger. And it's coming to the point where not every town now has the suppliers of inputs. Not every town has the auction market in the terms of livestock sales. Certainly not every town has their own grain terminal, etc. And so we're often seeing farmers buying and purchasing inputs in larger and larger quantities. They're selling outside of the community. We're seeing farm size get larger in terms of acres. but fewer people to man those acres. And I use this as an example. So our son, who is 37 now, when he was growing up, he had a graduating class of nearly 400, of which about 50 were sons and daughters of farmers and ranchers. Today, to my knowledge, he is the only one of those 50 who are actively involved in production agriculture. So how sad is that? I look at it as twofold. Number one, the parents did not make that operation conducive, did not make it conducive for their children to come back and take over that farm or ranch. Number two, the current farm program does not make it conducive for young people to enter into agriculture. And I really think the only way we're going to put children in the seats of those local school systems, the only way we're going to put more businesses on Main Street in those rural communities is we have to take a step back a bit and focus on profitability rather than yield. Because if we increase profitability on these farms and ranches, we're going to grow the local economies.
Yeah, absolutely. Alan, anything there on local communities?
Yeah, absolutely. It's vital that we return to that. Right here in the state of Mississippi where I live, it's painfully evident when you go into any rural area. The little towns, the communities, all of that are boarded up. Many little towns and so forth, and communities that were vibrant just a few decades ago. And they were vibrant because of the local ag economy. Many of those people are now living in a food desert. They're getting the majority of their food at things like a Dollar General, convenience stores, things like that.
Do they sell food at Dollar General?
I don't call it food.
Right.
Dollar General does.
That was my ad. That's where I was going with that.
Substance.
Yeah,
Right.
food like substances.
We're they're having to drive into cities to have a job, and we're seeing higher levels of depression, anxiety, a lot of drug problems, meth issues, things like that. So that's what we're seeing. And I'll share a quick little story that is true and happened right here in the county that I live in Mississippi, that to me, symbolizes what has happened. So in Oktibbeha County, Mississippi, in the first half of the 1900s, in that one single county, there were more than 800 dairy farms. There were 5 creameries, and all the communities and little towns around the county were vibrant, active, and, principally supported through all of this agriculture. And then there was a lot of, businesses that supplied those 800 plus dairy farms, along with farms that were producing other things. So, but along comes our USDA and our land grant universities, and they began to tell these dairy farmers who had small breeds like Jersey and Guernsey and Ayrshire and so forth, and had them all out on pasture. And all of these herds were mostly small, 30, 40, 50 cows. And yet they were supporting their families quite well on that. Well, they were now being told, okay, nope, you're doing it all wrong. Your breed's wrong. You got to move. You got to change to these Holsteins, that were much larger. So they got them to change their genetics. So they went from genetics that were epigenetically adapted and very efficient to genetics that could not perform in the vast majority of environments without high input. Then they told them it's much more efficient. You don't want to be grazing your cows. Why are you doing that? It's much more efficient to plow up your pastures, plant them in crops, harvest those crops, and then bring them to the cow. That's just so much more efficient. So now they have to go out and buy farming equipment. And they talked them into putting up silos and harvest stores and all of that to store the silage to feed the cows. And because they had to put their cows up, now they had to have housing for those cows. So now they had to spend money on the barns to house the cows. And then they were told, no, the way you're milking the cows is all wrong. You need to put in these fancy milking parlors. And so then they spent money on that. So everything that they were told to do involves spending money. And unbelievably, they did it. Okay. And they made these transitions. So we fast forward to today in an Oktibbeha County, Mississippi, where just 50 years ago, there were 800 plus dairy farms that were making money. Today, there are 0 private dairies in the county, not a one. And we know where many of those were because they're marked by a blue tombstone, a blue harvest store that used to store the silage for those dairies. And many of these farms are in great disrepair. All of those people are driving in, to the city to work. And the most ironic thing about it is the only dairy that is still in operation in Oktibbeha County, Mississippi, is the Mississippi State University Research Dairy. Okay. And why is that still in operation? Because it's the only one supported by taxpayer dollars. Yeah. Now that is a synopsis of what has gone on across rural America.
And we could tell that story for literally any commodity or type of livestock production.
Yeah, and what was the one of the driving forces, maybe not the driving force, but what was or one of the reasons why that stopped working was the removal of diversity from the landscape. I mean, you think about how many different things were happening on most of those operations. You had 30 or 40 milk cows, you had some pigs, some chickens, some, just keep calling the roll, and you probably weren't growing one single monocrop. It was a rotation of multiple crops at the very least, if not an intact grassland. It's not.
So think of that, Clay. I'm just going to step in and spin off that. Look at the diversity there. And then all of us here know that you can drive across 1,000 miles of the I states and out of the I states, Eastern Dakotas and Nebraska, et cetera, Kansas, and see nothing but corn and soybeans. Okay. Now, on the last podcast, I mentioned about the land values in California plummeting in the Central Valley because of lack of water. Well, what's produced in the Central Valley primarily? Vegetables, right? Okay. Do we not have the soils and the climates to produce vegetables in the Midwest, in those I states? And you tell me which is going to be more profitable. And Alan alluded to it last podcast, an acre of field of corn or an acre of sweet corn, which is going to be more profitable, which is going to bring more money. And then you start talking tomatoes and carrots and, dry edible beans and any type of vegetable, and take a look at that. And we can do it without irrigation. And we just need to get back to those type of production model. One thing that COVID, don't get me wrong, there was many bad things about COVID, But one of the things we've noticed at Understanding Ag is a real awakening by consumers and an increased awareness of where their food comes from. I credit part of that to COVID. People really, they were concerned about their food and where it comes from. And we've seen a rebirth or resurgence of localized food systems. And I think that's the perfect opportunity for any farm or ranch who is unprofitable, and also any farm or ranch to get off the government support wagon and make a decent living. Alan?
Again, when we go back to the Oktibbeha County, Mississippi story, when those 800 plus dairy farms were making a living supporting their families off of 30, 40, 50 cows, they were low input. They were working with their environment. They had positive epigenetics, and they were not trying to outproduce their environment, and they were not chasing yield. They were simply chasing net profit, net value. And that is what we have to get back to. The other thing is that those folks had a much higher quality of life than the vast majority of our farmers and ranchers do today, because they weren't consumed by debt, by anxiety, by fear. And they had a really, really nice lifestyle. And I know right now today, many of those. And they have shared their stories about how good their lives were, before all of these radical shifts and changes were made, and how they seriously regret that. So it matters. It matters a lot. And, it also matters relative to national security. That is something that we're now working in. And I'm very, very happy to say that our Department of Defense has now officially recognized that the way we farm and ranch does make a difference. And they are now supporting regenerative farming and ranching. We are actively involved on several military installations in doing regenerative grazing. And they want to train particularly their special forces in regenerative agriculture, because they feel like the very best way to calm a situation anywhere in the world is to make sure that those people are well fed and well watered. That is what keeps situations calm. And if they can send in special forces, not to have to fight, but to train, educate, teach, and equip people in all of these other countries how to farm and ranch regeneratively and feed themselves, then we have greatly eliminated a lot of conflicts and potential for conflict around the world.
I think that in our divided nation, we are primed to reject ideas based on who said them, not based on whether or not they're true or false. And I'll be honest, the first time I heard that idea that, feeding, having people well fed and watered would contribute to them being more conducive, just more not revolting, not engaging in revolution. It came from a source that I was primed to reject. And so I was like, I don't know about that. But then we also, at the same time, talk about ideas like 72 hours to chaos. Like if you want to see chaos in an area, shut off the food supply for 72 hours and you'll see chaos. And so I think it does make sense. It is one of those things that, if we could just figure out how to train people to be self reliant in a sustainable way, then there's massive benefits for those those localities, and I think that's an admirable goal for sure.
Yeah. Clay, I just have to talk a little bit about how on the last podcast we talked about the current farm program and how it is not conducive to profitable farm production. And why is it that we continue, our lawmakers continue with that farm program? Well, fact of the matter is, what matters more to those lawmakers than anything else? It's getting reelected, right? Okay. What will keep one thing that will keep them from getting reelected is an unhappy constituency, a hungry constituency. You run out of food or food becomes higher priced, that's going to make the voters unhappy. They're going to vote those lawmakers out of office. So I look at food as being one of the reasons, the fact that the lawmakers want to be reelected and they want a cheap food policy. And I would contend we no longer have cheap food, we have cheap food-like substances. But that's what it's led to, is where we're at today. So the challenge then, how do we get out of it, right?
Yeah.
How do we
absolutely.
right the ship, so to speak?
Yep, for sure. And so along those lines, what is happening in agriculture? We've talked about this a little bit on the last podcast with regard to water holding capacity, and we have floods and dust storms within days of each other in the same area. But what is happening with soil health in general? I mean, is there progress being made in that regard, or are we still at this point going backwards?
We are making progress in just what we've been able to achieve within understanding ag alone, validates that. So, when Gabe and myself, along with David Brandt and Ray Archuleta first formed Understanding Ag, we had basically 0 consulting acres. And now we're on more than 36 million in 8 years. In 8 years, we've gone from 0 to more than 36 million acres that we're consulting on. So that's significant progress in a very short period of time. And if we go back real quick to this Department of Defense deal, I don't know how many people in the U.S. realize just the number of military installation acres there are on U.S. soil alone, not counting foreign soil. But here in the U.S., the Department of Defense has more than 14 million acres that they're operating on. So we start getting those acres under regenerative management. Now we've got another 14 million that we can tack on. So now we're over 50 million acres, that are being managed regeneratively. So this is definitely expanding, increasing awareness has radically increased. It's hard for any rancher or farmer now not to have at least heard of regenerative agriculture. They may not know much about it yet and understand it yet, but at least they have begun to hear about it. And that's the first step. Every marketing and advertising agency knows that repetition matters. That people have to see an advertisement, a commercial, whatever, at least 8 times for the average person before they actually pull the trigger on something, right? So it's no different here. Farmers and ranchers have to hear and be exposed to regenerative agriculture multiple times before they finally pull the trigger on it. The consumer's the same way. They have to hear about regenerative agriculture and regenerative food multiple times before they finally decide maybe that's what I need to be buying and feeding to my family.
Yeah. If I may expand on that, Clay, Regenified hired a third-party firm to do a very in-depth consumer survey as to regenerative agriculture and demand for regeneratively grown and raised products. It was really interesting because it showed that at the end of 2021, only about 6% of consumers were aware of regenerative agriculture. Okay. The years 2022, 2023, that increased to 22%. 2024 here, it increased to 47%. Okay, it's more than doubling every 1 to 2 years. And we're seeing that. We're seeing a marked increase in demand. Oftentimes now, Understanding Ag has brands and industries reaching out to us, and they come to us for a variety of reasons. Some understand that regenerative agriculture can help make their supply chain more resilient. So they want their growers to use these regenerative practices so they have that consistent supply of high quality product. Others are coming because of the nutrient density, which I know we're going to talk about. And they firmly believe that regenerative agriculture can give a higher quality product. And then others are coming because simply they know it's the right thing to do. And they want the story. And speaking of stories, if I may, I'll share a story of a client of ours that I think really goes to show the potential for profitability if a farm or ranch goes down this regenerative space. So in the fall of 2018, after harvest was done, we had a couple reach out to us, and they farm in the northern Great Plains, about 4,500 acres of cropland, all rented, no owned land, no livestock integration. And they were doing okay, but they just wanted something different. There wasn't the profitability that they really wanted. They felt stressed. Their 2 children were not interested in farming or ranching, and they just knew there had to be something else. So they attended one of our soil health academies because education is key. That's the first thing. As Alan states, we have to educate. And they learned about the 634, the principles, rules, and processes. To their credit, they became very intentional. They had a fairly diverse crop rotation. They were growing 6 or 7 different cash crops. They expanded that a little bit. But any acre that could not be farmed due to moisture, etc., they planted a cover crop on those acres, even though they didn't have any livestock. They then, when they harvested a crop, they immediately seeded a cover crop. They started backing off considerably on their post-emergent herbicides. They did a pre-emergent herbicide, but they really limited post-emergent and no burn down, before harvest, pre-harvest burn down. They eliminated all insecticides off their farm, no more seed treatments, okay? Fungicides were reduced significantly. Well, this past winter, that farmer called me and he asked if I was going to be home. He was going to be down in Bismarck and he wanted to stop by. And so he stops by and we get visiting. He says, Gabe, I wanted to thank Understanding Ag because this is where I'm at today. He said, 100% elimination of insecticides, 100% elimination of fungicides, 100% elimination of pre-harvest burn down, spot spray only post-emergent. Okay. He said he's eliminated herbicides 40 to 60%, depending on the crop. Fertility inputs, 40 to 60% reduction, depending on the crop. And he said, Gabe, I'm so profitable now. I just bought a half a section of cropland and I paid cash. Okay. Imagine that. That takes some money. But then he added another sentence. And to me, this says it all. He said, Gabe, the thing my wife and I are most happy about, our 2 children now want to consider farming. And I tell you what, that to me says it all. But besides that, he started taking over and understanding that there's other ways to make money besides commodities. And now he looks at opportunities, and he looks for opportunities on his farm or ranch. He's bringing his neighbor's livestock on to graze some of those cover crops, adding another revenue stream, plus enhancing soil health. He is growing an even wider array of different cash crops, but he's marketing them directly himself, further increasing his profitability. I mean, what a wonderful story and testament to regenerative agriculture.
Absolutely. And I think that all goes and connects into people who sit down and take an honest assessment of their ranch or farm and look at, what are the cost centers and what are they actually generating for us as far as a return. And I think that's a big part of what Understanding Ag does, is help people analyze their farm or ranch business. So what are, generally speaking, the primary cost centers for a farm or ranch?
Well, we've, in our earlier podcast, we certainly talked about the primary cost centers of a ranch. It's what those animals eat. That is the number one cost. The amount of heavy metal equipment that they own is another principal cost center. And as we said in the prior podcast, way too many on way too much unnecessary equipment, and it rusts, it breaks down, it requires repair and maintenance, it requires insurance, it depreciates, on and on. The third principal cost center is the supplemental feedstuffs and the vet meds, that are being utilized in these productions. And then the fourth is FTE, full-time equivalents. How many people do you have to hire, to run the number of livestock that you have? So those are the principal cost centers. If we look at a row crop operation, it's really fairly similar, except for the mouths to feed, or you may transition that to the plant mouths that you're having to feed. But, the principal cost centers are going to be certainly heavy metal. Way, way, way too many row crop farmers have they're vastly over equipmented, if that's a word. They are trying to outproduce their environment. So they have very high input costs that are associated with their cropping production, in terms of, chemicals, synthetic fertility, amendments, all the things that they're adding to the soil. And many of them also have too many FTEs relative to what they really could be doing in their production. And they're trying to farm way too much land, to be honest with you. They can't focus, they can't implement decent practices, conservation or regenerative practices, because they're just trying to cover way too much territory, thinking they got to do that, to make a living. Gabe?
Yeah, if I might expand on that a bit, look at inputs from a fertility standpoint on most commodity crops. Most farmers hire agronomists to go take a soil sample, and then that sample is ran and it shows the farmer the inorganic fraction of nutrients that are available the day that sample was taken. Well, in studying soils, we know that soils are a biological system, yet these tests are not looking at things biologically. So understanding ag, Ellen mentioned we're on over 36 million acres now. We've soil sampled, obviously not every acre, but a substantial portion of those 36 million acres. One of the tests we do with every new client on their land is a TND test, total nutrient digestion, which looks at not only the inorganic fraction of nutrients, but the organic fraction of nutrients. In other words, how much is tied up in the soil itself and not water soluble, or in other words, available immediately to the plants. 36 million acres, we've never tested a single acre that is deficient in nutrients. There's plenty of nutrients for profitable crop production. Okay. The fact of the matter is, those nutrients are not available. Why? Because we're missing the biology and the living, diverse plant ecosystems to make them available. So one of the things we strive to do at Understanding Ag is educate. Have farmers do those suite of tests, and then we do split trials on cropland. Farm half of a field according to the way you've been doing it. Have a zero check strip, a small area of zero check strip, because it always amazes farmers how much production they can get without applying any inputs. And then the rest of the field is seeded using Understanding Ag's recommendations, which are based off of that suite of tests, how much biology you have. But in that way, we're able to keep accurate track of profitability and show our clients that they can actually increase their profitability if they move down this regenerative path.
I think that a lot of what we've talked about here is related to more and more inputs. And I think, what you said, Alan, too, about farming way too many acres. And one thing that I've heard from multiple Understanding Ag consultants, including both of you, is that the vast majority of ranches are overstocked. So is that kind of the analog? The vast majority of farms are farming too many acres?
Yeah, it is. And that's both beef and dairy. They tend to be greatly overstocked, and they're overstocked because they believe that's what they have to do to be profitable, but that is actually driving profitability out of the equation for them. And 9 times out of 10, when we go and work with a client that is overstocked either on beef cattle or dairy cattle, and we often reduce their stock capacity, very quickly in the first year, anywhere from 30 to 50%. And that very year, they realize more net profit. Okay. And Clay, I'll say this, it is very easy for us to go into a livestock operation, a ranch, a dairy, whatever, and in year one, reduce their per cow cost by at least $100 annually. That's easy. That's not a problem for us to do at all. If they'll listen to us and implement, they can very easily reduce their annual cow cost by at least $100. It's very easy for us to go onto a row crop farm and in year one to reduce input cost by 20%. Again, those things are not hard to do at all, but they just have to be intentional about their application of the principles and the rules to capture the ecosystem processes.
Yeah. And if I may expand on that just a little bit, Clay, this is not an issue strictly with the U.S. Yeah. So this fall, we had a couple of our consultants down in Uruguay and Argentina, wherever they traveled in, and Alan, how many ranches were they on? It was a lot of them. Every single one overgrazed, overstocked. In the UK, Alan and I have spent a considerable amount of time in the UK and Ireland the past 3 years. 95+% of them. Well, I got to be honest, 99+% of them overstocked. No matter where we go, they're overstocked. And then what happens? Okay. More processed feed inputs, greater expense. Anytime you put iron between the mouth of that animal, right, and the land, it's costing you money. And there's just no reason for it. It amazes me how often traveling down Texas, Oklahoma, etc., how many bales of hay I see. And I just shake my head. I just can't understand why in that environment they need that.
And that's how you increase net profitability, right? I mean, when you go about reducing the debt, reducing the reliance on inputs, you're going to improve net profitability. If you don't have to have a feed processor and a tractor to go out and feed the cows every day, I was just thinking about that today. I took 5 of the 6 of us in my family out to build a new paddock for the livestock. Took us an hour, so that's 5 total hours, but it's enough feed for a week. Mm-hmm. That's 5 hours a week.
Yeah.
I know a lot of ranches that spend 5 hours a day feeding their cattle, and we didn't burn any diesel to do it. And, they had these things underneath them called legs. They just walked into the next paddock and there was a whole week's worth of food right in front of them.
That's
but,
right.
And then the same thing with the farms, if we can reduce the number of passes, you talk about 60 to 40% reduction in synthetic fertilizer nutrients, because every acre you've tested has enough nutrients. They're just not available because they lack biology. 40 to 60% reduction in pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, and still you got that check strip in the middle that is still relatively productive, So, I mean, that's the way to reduce those things is on some level, it's just stop doing them, but then also replace that with intentional management.
Exactly. We're so screwed up in this country. We give awards based on yield. I have a novel idea. Let's give an award based on profitability. Okay. And see who's happier at the end of that, right?
What has been the demonstrable pace of progress if someone's intentional in the 6, 3, and 4?
Well, that's we have done an analysis on a number of our clients' farms and ranches, and especially looking at the first 4 years of progress. And I've presented this data several times now, and it is really rather remarkable. So what we're seeing is that and it doesn't matter where you're located. So whether you're in a more temperate environment, semi-arid environment, whatever, we're seeing a very definitive 4-year timeline here if you are intentional, okay, in your application of the principles and the rules. And so in the first 4 years, we have noted significant progress. So let me give you an example. So one of the things that we looked at was depth of soil aggregation. And in this analysis of a number of our clients' farms and ranches, we found that at the end of year 1, they had increased aggregate depth by an average of about 2.5 inches. By the end of year 2, they had expanded that to almost 5 inches. And then by the end of year 3, to an average aggregate depth of almost 7 inches. Now, that's pretty darn good linear progress, right? And soil aggregation is a key indicator of many other favorable functions happening in the soil. Water infiltration, ability, oxygen being able to infiltrate the soil, microbial functioning, nutrient cycling, all of those things. But here's the kicker. What we found is that by the end of year 4, we had increased soil aggregate depth to an average of almost 15 inches. So what we are definitively seeing is that in the first 3 years, we are building the soil microbial population, the active living microbial population, to a point of critical mass. And once we reach that point of critical mass, we see an explosion, an exponential benefit. So the first 3 years, we see linear positive progress. But by year 4, we now begin to experience exponential progress. Now, that is huge, now that we know that. And again, it doesn't matter where you're located, you can make that kind of progress in your first 4 years. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about livestock production, crop production, or whatever. So if I could, triple my investment value in 4 years, I'm going to be ecstatic. Who would not be? So if I can improve my soil and the function of my soil that dramatically within just 4 years, why would we not be ecstatic about that as well?
Yeah. And you look at that, the depth of aggregation has so many positive compounding effects: water infiltration, water holding capacity, biology, the nutrient cycle is going to be enhanced, the water cycle is enhanced. It's just a win-win-win situation. So often, farmers, ranchers think, I got to go rent more land. One of the things we focus on with our clients is, are you utilizing the land you have to its full production potential? And along with that, a sidebar here, Clay, a bit. So often when we go on to new clients' farms and ranches, they take us to their poorest producing tract or pasture, and that's the one they want to focus on. And we say, no, you're coming at it in the wrong way. Let's see your highest producing and see, has that reached its full potential? Chances are not even close. That's going to bring you the greatest return on your time and effort of moving down the regenerative path. So let's focus there, and let's worry about that poor tract way at the end, that poor producing tract.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the other thing that we're noting, Clay, from our evaluation of our clients, many of them, as Gabe mentioned earlier, have gone to, multiple enterprises, and what we are seeing is that regenerative farms that have multiple enterprises are not only making faster progress, but they are producing anywhere from 4 to 11 times more food per acre than conventional farms are. So we keep hearing this argument that, that regenerative stuff is nice, but we can't feed the world that way. And my contention is, no, you're wrong. We can't feed the world conventionally. If we keep going the way we're going there, we are going to face famine. We are going to face issues. But we can more than feed the world without any problem whatsoever by farming regeneratively, because every acre is producing a lot more food, and not just food, but much more phytonutrient-rich food than the commodity farming, the conventional farming is. So again, why would we not be doing this is my question.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing you talked about, the aggregation, another thing that does for you is drought resiliency, which is kind of where we started on the last podcast. If you've got water down deep enough, those roots can get at it later on when they need it. That's a good thing as well. So along the lines of what you were just talking about with the phytonutrient research and some of those things, what are some of the most exciting things that you guys are seeing right now? What are some of the most exciting developments? We've tried to inject some good news here along the way as we've been talking about where we're at over these last two episodes, but what are some of the most exciting developments you're seeing?
I'll go back to our research that I just presented and the pace of progress. If we can make that much progress within the first 4 years, why would we not do that? And to me, that's incredibly exciting because that's a radical game changer. The second thing that I would mention is the phytonutrients. And the more research that is being conducted here in collaboration with Dr. Stefan Van Vliet and his team, the more exciting that is becoming. Because if we can produce foods that are much more phytonutrient dense, guess what? We solve an awful lot of problems that our population is facing right now, from obesity to inflammatory, caused diseases, on and on and on. So we're far healthier, and that's huge. That not only means we have greater quality of life, but over our lifetime, we're also saving a heck of a lot of money because we're spending a lot less money on super expensive medical care and that type of thing. And we're more productive throughout our life because we don't have the illnesses and the ailments and so forth, that are brought about by the terrible diets that too many people are eating. The third thing that I would say that is really exciting is that we can radically alter for the better our economic position as farmers and ranchers and revitalize rural economies. So those will be the top three things for me. Okay.
Yep. I certainly agree with that. The work that Dr. Van Vliet and his team are doing, the research on soil health and soil function that's taking place. I myself am super excited about the not only possibility, because it is becoming reality that more and more people will start thinking of food as preventative medicine, as health, and then in turn, farmers and ranchers can be rewarded and paid for the nutrient density that they're producing. And I really think, Clay, we're not too many years away from that happening. There's going to be a big pushback by the agri-industrial complex who are not going to want to see that happen. But I think with healthcare costs exploding, as Alan said, the incidences of these chronic illnesses, farmers and ranchers are very close to being able to be rewarded for producing nutrient-dense food, along with perhaps providing these ecosystem services, all of those. I couldn't be more excited for the future of agriculture. And there are a lot of farmers and ranchers already who are gleaning the rewards from this.
Certainly. And I see that you guys were involved also in the Roots So Deep research. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
That was a pretty amazing trial. We had multiple states involved, and we had neighboring farms, in every state, one operating regeneratively, the other operating conventionally. And the producers were told to continue to do things the way they were doing them during the whole trial. And we sent in a team of 25 plus scientists every year to collect an incredible array of data, everything from soil data, soil biology, chemical, physical, biological, to greenhouse gas data, to biodiversity data, to animal performance and economics data, you name it. So it covered the gamut. And I'll share with you some of the highlights of that. So what we found was that the regenerative farms, first of all, were a 4 times more powerful greenhouse gas sink than the conventional neighbors, the immediate next door neighbors. And that's huge. Secondly, the regenerative farms had 3 times more grassland bird species. Now, birds can go wherever they want, right? So why were they on one side of the fence rather than the other? Well, they're smart enough to know where the best food and the best habitat is, and that's where they're going to go. So the birds told us where they would prefer to live, and they preferred to live on the regenerative farms versus the conventional farms. We also found 33% more beneficial insects on the regenerative farms versus the conventional farms, 25% more microbial species in the soil that were living inactive. And one of the things that we've been talking about, this ability to be able to infiltrate water and all of that, well, guess what we found there? The regenerative farms could infiltrate per acre per hour, 2.3 times more rainfall than their immediate next door conventional neighbors. Now, I'm very happy to report that at the end of this multi-year trial, 80% of the conventional farmers have now transitioned to regenerative production because of the data that was presented comparing the neighbors to each other. And 2 of the most influential data were ability to infiltrate water. They couldn't believe that we both get an inch of rainfall and we're immediate next door neighbors, and you're infiltrating 2.3 times more rain than I can. Okay. And then the second was birds. They just had a hard time believing that their neighbors had more birds, and that really, really impacted them. Mm-hmm. So when I asked that question, what were the most impactful factors? 9 times out of 10, the very first thing that people say, well, it's obviously the economics, the profitability. Was the profitability better on the regenerative farms? Absolutely it was. But that was not the top reason that they transitioned. They transitioned because their neighbors had more birds and they could infiltrate more water. So the stewardship aspects of that were the things that were the most convincing.
That's powerful. Very, very good stuff. We're going to point towards wrapping up here. Really appreciate you guys taking the time to have this conversation. But what do you see coming down the pike? What's next? What are you paying attention to?
Yeah, I really think that in the near future, regenerative agriculture will be the norm. We just finished surveying our clients, and what we've found is that if you offer the education and they truly apply themselves and learn, we have over a 92% success rate with farmers and ranchers who start moving on this regenerative journey, continuing with it. 92%, that's pretty unheard of, and for so many reasons, as Alan just stated, the profitability reasons, family. I mean, Clay, you mentioned about you taking family members, setting up a new paddock for the week. What better way to bond with your family? And I bet you had some fun while you were out there doing it, right? And you didn't.
My kids tied their sleds onto the back of the pickup, and I drug them all the way out there. So they loved it.
There you go. See, there's so many positive reasons. I think where we're at with the recent election here in the States, the focus that many within the upcoming administration have on health and stewardship, I think we're going to see some positive change there.
Yeah, it was after the election that I told my wife, I said, I think this is a really good time to be an agricultural podcaster, especially a regenerative agricultural podcaster, because I think the the interest and the demand is only going to increase over the next, whatever it is, 2 to 4 to 8 years, Alan, you got anything that you see coming down the pike that's really caught your attention?
Yeah, first, I would agree with Gabe. I think we're getting closer and closer to reaching that tipping point where farmers and ranchers are going to now begin to say, whoa, I'm missing the boat if I'm not pursuing this regenerative thing.
I would say we're already at the tipping point from a consumer demand perspective, right? I mean, I think you said it was something like 40% or something like that.
47%.
And I think Malcolm Gladwell's number is 17%. So and you saw that from once you got over that 20% number, it increased not just linearly, but exponentially in that awareness. So I think we're already there from consumer demand. Now we need to have the production to meet the demand.
But see, that's the key driver though, Clay. Farmers and ranchers in the U.S. are now less than 1% of the total population. Yeah, so we can't drive anything. We're too few. It is the consumers, so the 99%. They're the ones that are going to drive this. And so as that awareness increases, it's very, very obvious they are going to be the determining factor here. Their food purchase decisions are going to set the bar and are going to determine how we move forward. And with the data that we now have that clearly shows the phytonutrient benefits, the direct health benefits to the consumer, coupled with the fact that when they buy regeneratively produced foods, they're also supporting the rebuilding of rural economies. They are supporting the regeneration of our soil, our biodiversity, our ecosystems, our environment, and our climate. There's no loss here. This is a win-win-win all the way across the board. And as people discover that, then it is going to take on a life of its own. And I do believe we are very close to that.
Very good. I think that's a great place to wrap up. Gabe, Alan, thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Clay.
Thank you, Clay.
Very good stuff, as always, with Gabe Brown and Dr. Alan Williams. Appreciate them taking the time once again to join me and just share kind of their experience, Understanding Ag and the Soil Health Academy doing great work. Understanding Ag now crossing over 36 million acres of consulting work that they've done, and very high success rate of those who have gone through the Soil Health Academy and gotten intentional with these practices. 92%, I think, is what Gabe said there. So good on them. Really appreciate the opportunity to partner with them to get the word out about regenerative agriculture and the work that they're doing to continue to move that ball down the field. Coming up next on the Working Cows podcast, just a next Monday episode that you'll hear is the talk that I gave at the annual South Dakota Grassland Coalition meeting, and they've expanded their meeting now to a full day, and I think even maybe next year they're shooting for a 2-day meeting and trying to bring in some keynotes and some breakout sessions and make it more of a conference. And so very great group of people, South Dakota Grassland Coalition, just an incredibly innovative and an important group of people who are doing great work and continuing to push the envelope and be leaders in this space as far as regenerative agriculture is concerned, and managing intact grasslands. So really appreciated the opportunity to go and speak to them, and would encourage you to consider keeping the end of 2025 open in your calendar for the 2025 South Dakota Grassland Coalition's annual conference. So look forward to that, and look forward to seeing you again real soon on another episode of the Working Cows podcast.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.